Hunting season has always been more than just a hobby for me. It's my yearly escape from the relentless grind of everyday life. Every November, like clockwork, I drive up to New Hampshire, rent a small Airbnb near the woods, and spend a weekend trying my luck in the quiet wilderness. Owning a cabin for just one trip a year never made sense to me, so I settle for these cozy, rented getaways. My uncle used to join me, but his health has been on a slow decline. And these days, I go alone. In 2022, I made the familiar drive once again, eager for the fresh air and the thrill of the hunt. The plan was simple: a weekend alone, just me and the woods. Maybe I'd bag a deer, or if I was really lucky, a moose. The drive up was long, and by the time I arrived at the Airbnb, the sun had long since set. The dirt road leading to the cabin stretched out in front of me, a narrow, winding path surrounded by pitch-black forest. As I pulled up, I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, soaking in the silence. It was dead quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you. No bugs, no wind, just stillness. The key was right where the host said it would be, under the mat. I let myself in, grateful for the warmth that greeted me. The owner had already cranked the heat, a welcome comfort in the cold New Hampshire air. The cabin itself was simple but cozy, a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and just enough space to unwind. There was Wi-Fi and cable, though I didn't plan on using either much. I set my bags down, unpacked a bit, and checked the time. The early start tomorrow was all I could think about. So I set an alarm for dawn, the perfect time to catch some game. As I lay down that night, the silence outside felt almost too heavy, but I shook it off. After all, that's what I came for. The solitude, the quiet, the escape. Little did I know, something far more unsettling than the isolation was waiting for me. The next morning, I was out in the woods, within 30 minutes of waking up. The air was crisp, my breath visible in the early light, and everything felt still, almost too still. I found a decent spot behind some fallen trees and settled in for the waiting game. The wilderness around me was silent, the kind of silence that heightens your senses. I scanned the area for any sign of movement, mentally preparing myself for the long haul, but the silence was broken by something that sent a shiver down my spine. A man's voice, sharp and angry. "What the hell are you doing here?" I whipped around, my heart nearly jumping out of my chest. Standing behind me was a man, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and a hard look in his eyes. He wore no hunting gear, just a thick jacket, and his expression was twisted with annoyance. I stammered out a response, telling him I was just hunting, but his face didn't soften. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "Hunting's restricted here," he growled. I had no idea. The Airbnb listing hadn't mentioned anything about restricted areas, and I quickly tried to explain, but he cut me off, his words sending a chill through me. "I watched you ride up here." His gaze felt heavy, and something about the way he said it felt wrong. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was apologize and start gathering my things, trying to stay calm. As I slung my bag over my shoulder, I glanced back to where he had been standing, but the man had already disappeared into the trees, like he'd never been there at all. My heart pounded in my chest as I hurried back to my car, the unease settling deep in my gut. I drove to another park a few miles away where hunting was allowed, but the entire morning felt off. My focus was gone, my thoughts circling back to that strange encounter. When noon rolled around and I still hadn't seen any game, I decided to head back to the cabin to regroup. But as soon as I pulled up to the cabin, something felt off. The door was unlocked. I could have sworn I locked it before leaving. My stomach twisted. Had I been that careless? I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that maybe I'd been distracted when I left that morning. But as I walked inside, a cold dread crept up my spine. My bag was unzipped, and a few of my things seemed out of place. Small, subtle things, like my toothbrush not quite where I'd left it. Nothing was missing, but the unsettling feeling that someone had been in the cabin while I was gone gnawed at me. I shook it off. Maybe I was just paranoid after the encounter with that guy in the woods. I needed to clear my head, so I drove into town and grabbed some takeout. The drive helped calm my nerves, and by the time I returned, I convinced myself I was overreacting. I ate, took a short nap, and prepared for another attempt at hunting, but luck wasn't on my side. No deer, no moose, just the creeping feeling that I wasn't as alone as I wanted to be. As dusk settled over the forest, I called it quits for the day and headed back to the cabin. The shadows seemed to cling to the trees, and every rustle of leaves had me on edge. When I finally stepped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, though it was short-lived. I cooked a simple dinner and sat down on the small couch, trying to enjoy an old black and white movie on the TV, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My mind kept drifting back to that unlocked door, the stranger in the woods, the items that felt just slightly out of place. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling gnawed at me. I couldn't help but feel like something, or someone, was watching me. As I started to drift off, the soft sounds of the old movie barely holding my attention, a sharp click jolted me awake. My eyes shot open, and for a second I couldn't place what had happened. Then, I saw it. The closet door, in my bedroom, cracked open just enough to make my blood run cold. My heart pounded in my chest as my mind raced, connecting all the strange little details I'd been trying to ignore. The unlocked door, my belongings moved, the unsettling encounter with that man. I wasn't alone. Someone had been in the cabin. Asterisk, asterisk. Someone was still in the cabin. Dot, asterisk, asterisk. Adrenaline kicked in, and before I could think twice, I reached for my CZ-75 from my hunting bag. My hand trembled as I gripped it tightly, my breath shallow. I took a step toward the closet, feeling like I was moving in slow motion. My voice came out hoarse, but loud enough. Come out now, or I'll shoot. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. My heart pounded in my ears. Then, the closet door creaked open. To my horror, the man from earlier that day stepped out, the same twisted grin on his face. His front tooth was missing, making the smile even more grotesque. His eyes gleamed with something dark, something dangerous. You got me, he sneered, like this was all some kind of twisted game. I kept the gun trained on him, my hands shaking so hard I thought I might drop it. My stomach churned with fear, but I forced myself to stay focused. I didn't say a word. Instead, I slowly backed up, never taking my eyes off him, and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. My fingers fumbled as I dialed 911. The man took a small step forward, that smile still plastered on his face. You people, always coming up here, thinking you own the place. No respect for the land, for the parks. I didn't care what he was talking about. My only focus was on keeping him where he was and getting the police here as fast as possible. The operator answered, and I quickly told them my situation, barely able to keep my voice steady. They assured me deputies were on their way, but the seconds felt like hours. The man just kept talking, his voice low and bitter. I've been watching you, watching all of you. You're all the same, thinking you can just come up here, take whatever you want. I kept telling him to shut up, to stay where he was, but he wasn't listening. My fear grew with every word he said, every second that passed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights outside the cabin window. The deputies burst through the door, guns drawn, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. They arrested him on the spot. The man went without a fight, muttering about outsiders as they dragged him away in handcuffs. So I stood there, still shaking, unable to fully process what had just happened. Later, as the sheriff's deputies questioned me, the host of the Airbnb showed up. Instead of asking if I was okay, his first concern was about the cabin, whether anything had been stolen or damaged. He insisted I must have left the door unlocked, even though I was certain I hadn't. When I told him about the man, he acted like it was news to him, claiming he had no idea who the guy was, even after learning his name. I didn't sleep at all that night, too rattled by the events to close my eyes. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my bags and left that cabin behind. The peaceful hunting trip I'd been looking forward to had turned into something out of a nightmare. As I drove away, the weight of it all settled in. If I hadn't had my gun, if I hadn't heard that door click when I did, I don't know what would have happened. That was the last time I ever hunted alone. I ever hunted. I was 15 when this happened. My first year hunting deer with my family. It was me, my father, and my cousin out in the deep woods of Michigan. If you've never been there during winter, it's brutal. The cold bites right through your skin, and darkness comes early, swallowing up the light by late afternoon. Once the sun sets, it feels like the entire world goes silent. We had a plan. My blind was 2 miles south of my dad's stand, his about 9 miles from our camp. That morning, we rode out on a four-wheeler, splitting up as we each headed to our spots. I didn't mind the walk ahead of me, though it was a decent hike. Being alone out there felt like part of the adventure. By the time 4 p.m. rolled around, the cold had fully sunk in, numbing my fingers and toes. I'd been sitting in my blind for hours, my .243 rifle resting on my lap. I hadn't seen a single deer, and the only thing I got was a few gusts of icy wind. With the temperature dropping and the sun almost gone, I decided to pack up for the day. I zipped up my blind, gathered up my trash, and slung my rifle, a pink camo-covered one, over my shoulder. As I tossed my garbage into the bucket, I heard a rustling behind me. My heart skipped a beat, thinking maybe my luck had changed and a deer was finally nearby. I froze, listening intently, but after a few moments the sound stopped. Probably just a squirrel, I thought, trying to shake off the disappointment. With nothing left to do, I turned and started the long walk back to meet up with my dad, not knowing that something far worse than a deer was lurking in those woods. I had just left my blind when something caught my eye. A fresh path, cut right through the leaves. It was wide, much too wide for a deer or any small animal. At first I thought it could have been a bear or maybe a wolf, but something about the way the leaves were scattered felt wrong. It wasn't just the width of the path, but the sheer size of whatever had made it. The unease was instant. My skin prickled and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know why, but I felt like I was being watched. I didn't waste any time. The sun was setting fast, and I still had at least a mile to go before I reached my dad's stand. I picked up my pace, speed walking through the thick woods, the shadows of the trees stretching longer and darker across the path. The dim light of the moon barely pierced through the canopy above, and everything around me seemed to grow quieter, more oppressive. That's when I heard it. The sound stopped me cold, freezing me in my tracks. It was a low, guttural roar, somewhere between a bear's growl and something far more sinister. It almost sounded like a man in pain, like someone being torn apart. I've never heard anything like it before, and I hope I never do again. My blood turned to ice. An instinct kicked in. Without thinking, I bolted. Running through the woods with heavy boots, thick hunting gear, and a rifle strapped to my back was harder than I thought it would be, but I didn't care. Fear pushed me forward, my legs pumping furiously as I tried to put as much distance between me and whatever made that sound. The forest seemed to close in around me, the moonlight barely reaching through the thick branches, leaving me stumbling in the dark. My breath came out in ragged gasps, each one louder than the last, my heart pounding in my ears. About 25 seconds later, the sound came again, louder this time, and closer. I dared a quick glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. A figure, about 50 yards behind me, illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. It was tall, easily 10 feet, and thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. It moved in a way that was almost wrong, like its joints weren't put together right. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't an animal, and it sure as hell wasn't human. Panic hit me like a wave. I tried to run faster, my legs burning from the effort. I fumbled with the strap of my rifle, desperately trying to pull it off my back in case I needed to defend myself, but I couldn't slow down. I didn't know where I was running. All I knew was that I had to get away from whatever that thing was. I finally recognized the road, Rabbit Road. It was the one that connected our camp to the hunting area, and seeing it brought a flicker of hope. My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The lights of our cabin came into view, flickering through the trees in the distance. I pushed harder, running faster than I ever thought possible. Only when I reached the porch did I dare to stop. Breathing hard, I turned around one last time, praying that I had lost it. But it was still there. Farther away now, but standing motionless, its tall, black form silhouetted by the faint moonlight. It hadn't followed me all the way, but it hadn't left either. It just stood there, watching, its long arms and legs eerily still, as if it was waiting for something. My mind raced with terror as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but no matter how long I looked, I couldn't. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal, it was something else. My body couldn't take it anymore. As soon as I reached the porch steps, I collapsed. My stomach churned, and I threw up from sheer exhaustion and fear. I lay there, panting, shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My body felt drained and my mind was in overdrive, replaying the horrifying moments over and over. It felt like an eternity before I heard the rumble of my dad's four-wheeler pulling into the driveway. The moment I saw him, I stumbled to my feet and ran toward him, tears streaming down my face. I hadn't cried like that in years, but I couldn't stop myself. I clung to him like a little kid, sobbing uncontrollably as I tried to explain what had happened. Through gasping sobs, I told him about the path, the sound, and the figure. At first, he didn't believe me. He thought it was exhaustion, maybe my imagination playing tricks in the dark. But as I kept talking, pouring out the details, his face changed. He saw the fear in my eyes, the desperation, and slowly he realized I wasn't making it up. Something had been out there with me. That night, I didn't sleep. In fact, I barely slept for weeks after that. Every noise, every creak of the cabin had me on edge. People tried to tell me it was probably just a bear, or that I'd imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't from this world. I'm older now, and I still hunt, but I never go out alone anymore. And I always carry a bigger gun, just in case. It was a Friday evening, and I had just gotten home from school, thrilled for the weekend. I was 14, and hunting was my absolute favorite thing to do, especially at our family spot in Texas. My dad, Grandpa, and I had Ian going there for as long as I could remember. The ranch, with its 300 acres of dense woods and open fields, felt like home. It wasn't just about the hunting, it was the memories. The late nights by the fire, the early mornings in the blind, and the stories my grandpa would tell that seemed as old as the trees. That weekend was even more special. It was deer season, my favorite time of year. We pulled up to the ranch late, around 10 p.m., the headlights cutting through the thick darkness. The little shack we used as a camp wasn't much, just an old cabin with a couple of beds, but we didn't trust them. Not after my dad found a huge snake shed in one when I was little. From that point on, we always slept in a tent. It felt safer, somehow, more controlled. After we unloaded our gear, we all gathered around the campfire. The familiar warmth of the flames, the crackling wood, and the sounds of the night were comforting. We joked, shared stories, and laughed under the blanket of stars. Everything felt perfect until it happened. Out of nowhere, a scream pierced the stillness of the night. It wasn't human, but it wasn't quite animal either. The sound was close, too close, and it sent a wave of cold through my body. Every man around that fire fell silent, the laughter dying in our throats. We all exchanged uneasy glances. and for the first time in my life, I saw real fear in my dad's eyes. The ranch owner was the first to speak. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice shaky. No one had an answer. We just sat there, the night suddenly feeling darker, heavier. The ranch owner, an old man in his 70s, told us we had to go check it out. Nobody really wanted to, but we couldn't just sit around wondering what had made that sound. So, we hopped on my grandpa's ATV, the engine growling as we circled the perimeter of the campsite, our eyes scanning the darkness. Every bump in the trail, every shadow, made my heart skip. But after a solid search, we found nothing. No movement, no tracks, just silence. Still, that scream hung in the back of my mind. Even though we didn't find anything, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. By the time we returned to camp, the tension hadn't lifted. We tried to laugh it off, make jokes to calm our nerves, but I could see it in everyone's faces. We were all still rattled. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing the scream in my head, every little rustle of the wind or crack of a twig outside our tent, making me jump. The thought of going out into the woods, alone in the morning, terrified me. But hunting is hunting, and waking up before dawn is part of the deal. My grandpa wasn't the kind of man to coddle me or let me sit this one out. So, before the sun even hinted at rising, he dropped me off at the deer blind. It was pitch dark, the kind of dark where your own breathing feels louder than the world around you. I climbed the ladder slowly, my hands trembling with every rung. Once inside, I sat there, waiting, the silence of the woods pressing down on me. Every creak of the blind, every distant hoot of an owl felt too loud, too close. I kept replaying that scream from the night before, imagining what kind of creature could have made such a horrifying sound. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. My eyes strained against the darkness, waiting for the first light of dawn to make everything feel less alive. But then, I saw it. Movement on the trail. At first, I thought it was a deer. My heart leapt in excitement, thinking that maybe, just maybe, it was going to be a good morning after all. I grabbed the night vision sight my uncle had given me, eager to get a better look. But when I peered through it, my excitement drained away in an instant. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't even an animal. It looked like a person, but something was off. Its body was distorted, the limbs too long, the shoulders too hunched, like it didn't quite know how to stand properly. It was walking, slowly, down the trail. And then it stopped. I held my breath, not daring to move. And then it turned. It turned and looked asterisk right at me. Asterisk, I couldn't see its face clearly through the night vision, but I didn't need to. I knew it saw me. I could feel its gaze, cold and predatory. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat frozen, unable to pull my eyes away. And then it screamed. The same blood-curdling scream from the night before, only this time it was even louder. The sound rattled through the trees, through my bones, freezing me in place with a terror I had never felt before. I could barely breathe, my entire body locked in fear as that thing stood there, still staring at me. My heart was hammering in my chest as I tried to process what I was seeing. I couldn't make out its face through the scope, but I didn't need to. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and deliberate, like it was sizing me up. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but before I could move, that same scream exploded into the night. Only this time, it was deafening. Closer. The sound wasn't just loud. It felt like it reached inside me, twisting my insides, paralyzing me with a fear I'd never known. I was frozen, completely locked in place. My body refused to move, but my instincts finally kicked in. I grabbed my .22 rifle, hands trembling, and fired. I didn't aim. I didn't even care if I hit anything. I just needed to do something. The shots rang out in the stillness, echoing through the trees as I emptied the entire clip into the darkness. But I didn't stop. I grabbed my larger rifle and fired again. Round after round, the recoil biting into my shoulder, but I didn't care. I just wanted it gone. When the last shot faded into the night, I dared to look through the night vision again. It was gone. The trail, where it had stood, was empty, like it had never been there at all. My chest heaved, my mind still racing. I was shaking uncontrollably, unable to comprehend what had just happened. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me back to reality. I pulled it out, and there was a flurry of texts and missed calls from my dad and grandpa. They had heard it too. The scream. They knew something was wrong. We regrouped back at camp, our faces pale, all of us rattled. None of us spoke much as we huddled together, the campfire doing little to chase away the unease that hung over us. When daylight finally broke, we went to search the area where I'd fired, hoping to find some trace of what I'd seen. But there was nothing. No blood, no tracks, no signs that anything had even been there. It was as if the woods had swallowed it whole, leaving no trace behind. We searched for hours, but deep down, I knew we weren't going to find anything. Whatever that thing was, it had vanished. We still go back to that ranch to hunt, but it's not the same anymore. The woods feel different now. The once peaceful, familiar feeling has been replaced by something darker. Something I can't quite explain. I don't go out alone anymore. My dad or grandpa always sticks close, and I make sure to stay within sight of them. I don't know what that thing was, but it survived everything I threw at it. Every shot, every round. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, watching, waiting. And the worst part, I know it'll scream again.